Well, good day, everybody, and welcome to Financial Services Club and ESOP Center. The ESOP Center, the Employee Share Ownership Center, has been a fixture in a movement to encourage people to include employees in the sharing of wealth since it began back in 1984. And we're absolutely delighted today to be welcoming somebody who's been involved in that movement for many, many years, an acknowledged authority and writer on the subject, David Craddock. David runs his own consultancy, and this is going to be part of a number of webinars where we'll be featuring David. But today's webinar is here to provide very much an upbeat message for people on what's actually happening out there and why you should consider an EMI. So, David, with no further ado, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Michael, for that very kind introduction. Yes, I'm very pleased to be invited to lead this webinar. We're going to be focusing on enterprise management incentives today, which is the most tax efficient employee share scheme ever introduced anywhere in the world, not just the UK, but anywhere in the world. But before we go into the micro operations of how enterprise management works, I want to talk to this first slide about employee share schemes in general. We're very, very privileged in the UK to have what we call tax advantage schemes, previously known as tax-approved schemes. We are, in fact, only one of two countries in the world which have this plethora of tax-efficient scheme arrangements. In the UK, of course, we call them, as I've said, tax advantage schemes. In the US, where they have their own plethora of employee share schemes, they call them employee share plans, and they're known as tax qualifying plans. So enormously privileged in the UK to have these schemes to ignite our businesses into sharing success. So let's just go down this slide. I've shared a few interesting pointers which I want to share with you. The first is about the share. Yes, known in legal circles as a parcel of rights or a bundle of rights, sometimes called a bundle of rights and restrictions, but a very, very powerful mechanism indeed for wealth generation and indeed for business motivation. I'll share with you a little anecdotal story of many years back when I was introducing an employee share scheme in Ireland for an Irish company that had subsidiaries all over the world. Very, very interesting company indeed. And I was invited to the Shelbourne Hotel in the middle of Dublin to actually explain to the extraordinary general meeting how the employee share schemes worked. And a long-suffering shareholder, as he described himself, stood up at the back of the room and said, "It's all very well talking about employee share schemes, but what about share schemes for the long-suffering shareholders?" So I very courteously explained to him that the shareholding itself is the share scheme for the shareholders, and what we need to do is to bring the employees into an identity of interest with the shareholders through the employee share schemes. And so the message is this: that the shareholders have their shares, the employees have their employee share schemes, and so we have this identity of interest around the totem of the developing value of the share. The share is a wealth generator, it is a business motivator, both for the shareholders and for the employees. So let's just expand that principle of why introduce an employee share scheme. There is very, very substantial evidence to support the effectiveness of employee share schemes. And I've listed here some of the main reasons why companies actually introduce employee share schemes. The first is motivation and incentive, to motivate and incentivize the employees to higher levels of productivity and profitability in the business. To identify and involve employees in the business. So all the evidence portends to a very powerful identification and involvement that employees have in the business if they're identified with the share capital in the first place. And of course, this relies upon very properly defined communication strategies introduced by management in order to alert employees to the benefits of being employee shareholders. Retention and recruitment, very interestingly written into the fabric of the enterprise management incentives legislation, is that it must be introduced for commercial reasons. That's the purpose test. And commercial reasons are defined as the retention and recruitment of employees. This next point is to expand the base of reward. So traditionally, we reward employees through wages or salaries or pay, whatever term we want to give to that reward. The opportunity that is given by employee share schemes is to expand that basis of reward so that employees, as well as receiving their pay or their wages or their salary, can actually receive from the business dividends and the opportunity for capital gain. It's what we call the wages of capital. That's a term which was coined by Louis Kelso back in 1956 in Palo Alto, who started this trail of thought which has led to this explosion of interest in employee share schemes in the UK, in the US, and indeed subsequently throughout the rest of the world. To encourage consensus working. Okay, so one of the beautiful things about employee share schemes is that it is a subject which delivers individual reward, but also it's a corporate team working type activity. That individual reward will only be delivered if there is consensus working in order to produce a consensus result through the generation of wealth for the company as a whole. The evidence demonstrates that involvement in employee share schemes changes the business mindset. What do I mean by this? Well, I mean this, that what we're wanting to develop is the entrepreneurial instinct of the employees whilst working within the business. Yes, we want them to have the mentality of an entrepreneur, which produces creativity and initiative, and indeed gives the opportunity for a complete change in approach to how they think about working for the business. Then I've identified this final point in that little tranche of points to encourage employee interest. Yes, the employee is going to be acutely interested if they have an opportunity to benefit from the growth in the share value. So you can see how this commodity, which we refer to as a share, has this enormously powerful impact, the potential for an enormously powerful impact on the development of the business if it's contained within the employee share scheme arrangement. I've already mentioned the evidence for the effectiveness of employee share schemes. Studies really conducted in the UK and the US over the course of the last 40 years, including my own research, which I conducted back in the early 90s. I actually have behind me my book, Tolley's Guide to Employee Share Schemes. In that, there is explanations about all the different employee share schemes that we introduce, the legal minutiae, the tax minutiae, the governance minutiae, but also a couple of very powerful chapters on the empirical evidence to support the effectiveness of employee share schemes. And the evidence really supports these three key points. Bear in mind, I'm summarizing for purposes of this half-hour webinar. There's lots more you can read about in the book, but to improve productivity and profitability. Yes, there is significant evidence that properly implemented, properly communicated, recognize those two provisos, properly implemented and properly communicated, the introduction of employee share schemes has a very significant effect on the improvement of productivity and profitability in a company that's run efficiently and where indeed there is a market for the company's products. To maintain employment levels, okay, there's a macroeconomic argument here that employee share schemes actually has the capacity to maintain employment levels in businesses and indeed in the economy as a whole, and indeed to improve employment levels. And also, of course, to give stability to business operations. This really derives from the respect which is given to employees through the introduction of employee share schemes and the continuing communication process which companies are required to introduce in order to make the employee share scheme successful. It all augurs well for enhanced stability within the operations of the business. Very important not to lose sight of the fact that employee share schemes is a business subject, not just in motivation, incentive, identification, involvement, retention, and recruitment, but also to address some key strategic initiatives which companies might actually want to introduce, or the shareholders of companies might want to introduce into their businesses. One is investment diversification, allowing existing shareholders to sell some of their shareholding without losing control and maybe investing in other assets. So they diversify their investment portfolio beyond just an investment in the company which they've developed over many years. Succession planning, yes. the most effective way, the most commercially effective way, and indeed the most tax efficient way to introduce succession planning, and as I've noted here, a management buyout, is through embracing employee share schemes, working along employee share trust type arrangements. As Michael has mentioned, I'm going to be conducting another webinar either next week or the week after, date to be announced, which relates to a series of 5 case studies. And in those case studies, I identify how very practically employee share schemes can be used for investment diversification, for succession planning, and indeed for management buyouts. Now, this point about tax efficiencies, yes, employee share schemes come to the notice of businesses and their advisors, historically at least, primarily through what I call the tax bait. Yes, you throw the tax bait into the ocean, and people, just like the fish, take hold of it. They're interested. They're very interested in what might nourish them and what might nourish their businesses. The notion of an employee share scheme. But once we've actually attracted them through the attraction of the tax reliefs, we want them to recognise the commercial significance of employee share schemes, the opportunity to ignite their businesses, as I say, through the sharing of success and the involvement of the employees in employee share schemes. And in the UK, we call them, as I mentioned at the outset of this slide, the tax advantage schemes. Historically, we've called them the tax-approved schemes, and their equivalent in the US we call the tax qualifying plans. Out there, they don't like the word scheme, so we use the word plans. Next slide, Michael, please. So we're going to move on now to a detailed exposition, to the extent that it's possible within half an hour, of enterprise management incentives. Is within the microcosm of a company, how can enterprise management incentives ignite that business for sharing success? And why have we chosen to focus in this first webinar on enterprise management incentives? It is the most tax efficient scheme, yes, and indeed, if you can work enterprise management incentives to operate your employee share scheme in your company, then do so. And it might be that you can actually harness your enterprise management incentive scheme to a growth share, or maybe a reclassification, or maybe some other way in which you're actually wanting to formulate your employee share scheme arrangement. So let's just move down the key features which I want to show with you through this slide. Maximum option value. What do I mean by that? Well, I'm referring to the maximum initial market value, the unrestricted market value that we can use as the basis for granting share options. So what is the value of shares over which we can grant share options for purposes of enterprise management incentives? Well, by person, it's £250,000 maximum. For the company as a whole, it's an overall ceiling of £3 million. Now, clearly, in most company type arrangements, we're not going to get to that £250,000 limit at all. If it was, then for any company, there'd only be the opportunity to introduce it with regard to that maximum of 3 million, and 250,000 into 3 million is just 12 employees. Well, we want to introduce it for many more than that. So usually we're actually working with a model which is a market value of significantly less than that. By the way, we can introduce enterprise management incentives as an all-employee scheme if we wish to, although statutorily it's not actually legislated as an all-employee scheme. It is actually a discretionary scheme. So if you wish to, you can introduce it solely for a number of key employees, maybe senior executives. But if you so wish, you can actually expand it to introduce it as an all-employee scheme in practice, even though statutorily it's not an all-employee scheme. But recognise just how tax efficient this scheme is when compared with the next most tax efficient scheme, CSOP as we call it, Company Share Option Plan. Well, the maximum initial market value there is just £30,000 per person, whereas for EMI it's £250,000. What about waiting time for exercise? Well, in CSOP, you have to wait 3 years before you can exercise the option. The waiting time for exercise on EMI is whatever is set in the share option, the EMI share option contract. So it could be that there's an opportunity to exercise the option as soon as the option has been granted. It's whatever is agreed by the directors in the formulation of the share option contract. Discount at grant. Discount at grant. Well, under CSOP, the next most tax efficient scheme, it's not possible to introduce any discount at grant. You could actually technically introduce a premium, I suppose. That would not be a wise thing to do, but you can't introduce a discount. The options cannot be granted at less than market value. But for EMI, well, if you're working with existing recycled shares, potentially you can actually introduce it with a 100% discount, and we do that in many cases where we're recycling shares through an employee share trust, and those shares are going to be the shares over which the options are granted. Even if you're working with new issue shares, you can actually introduce a discount such that the option price is no more than nominal value. What about capital gains tax treatment? Man, this is powerful. This is so powerful. The capital gains tax treatment for enterprise management incentives is like it is for no other employee share scheme arrangement, because we have a special form of entrepreneurs relief. It's written into the fabric of the entrepreneurs relief legislation, section 169 of the Taxation of Chargeable Gains Act, 1992, and it allows individual participants of an enterprise management incentive scheme to participate in entrepreneurs relief, provided the time period from the date of grant to the date of sale of the shares is at least 2 years. So it's a different type of conditional arrangement than exists in the mainline entrepreneurs relief, where the shares have to be actually owned for a period of 2 years. So the time period from the date of grant to the date of sale of the shares has to be 2 years. And indeed, the shares don't have to have voting rights, as would be the case in relation to the mainline entrepreneurs relief. So just thinking about that, the individuals don't actually have to buy the shares technically until they're ready to sell, and that might be a feature which is necessary for the efficient operation of the employee share scheme in that particular company. It could be that they buy earlier, but the principle is that for the entrepreneurs relief, it's the time period from the date of grant of the option to the sale of the shares which actually counts. Okay, recognize that we construct employee share schemes in a whole host of different ways, and so we're looking to refine and bespoke every arrangement to meet the requirements of the particular company. And so it might be they have the opportunity to purchase earlier, it might be they have the opportunity only to exercise immediately prior to sale. Typically, where a company can exercise earlier, the company is actually wanting to give them the opportunity of receiving dividends during the natural life of the company, far in advance of any sale to an independent third party, or even indeed a flotation on a recognised stock exchange or an IPO. Restrictions. Well, we can actually introduce pretty much whatever restrictions we wish on the shares over which the options are granted. So we could, for example, introduce a restriction on voting rights, or restriction on dividend rights, or forfeiture provisions, or some sort of preemption type provision. What you're not wanting to do, of course, is to restrict the capital value opportunity, which, of course, is the manifestation of the wealth generation that is actually contained within the development of the share value. We can actually use a special class of shares, and often we do this with clients. Why might this be? There are a number of reasons, but the main reason which I'll alert you to through the slide is in order to make it possible to declare different rates of dividend compared with the main share capital. Let's go on to this next slide, which is a very interesting slide indeed. It's about the tax. At the date of grant of the option, no income tax and no national insurance contributions. Okay, so completely tax neutral at the date of grant. At the exercise of the option, the income tax and the NICs are only on any discount which was introduced at the date of grant. So let's look at an example. If the option price is £1 and the market value at date of grant is £5, that's a discount of £4 on market value at grant. We then come to date of exercise. The uplift in value from market value at grant to market value at exercise, let's say it's then £12, that increase in value of £7 from 5 to 12 is completely free of income tax and national insurance contributions. But at that date of exercise, the discount which was established at the date of grant is actually taxed. Okay. When we come to the date of sale, the increase in value from market value at date of grant to the sale proceeds amount, that's subject to CGT, and provided it meets the criteria for the special form of entrepreneur's relief, it's only taxed at 10%. Beautiful, is it not? Yes, do you not think? I think that's absolutely lovely. The disqualifying events, I'm going to expand on that a little later in the presentation, but the point about the disqualifying events is that it brings the opportunity for exercise forward. So this is typically if the individual leaves the company and they are given a right to exercise, or indeed if the company's taken over. They would be the two main disqualifying events. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. Well, this slide just expands a little bit on the tax treatment. It's a factual set of points that derive from the legislation, the EMI legislation, that the exercise, if it's going to happen at all, must happen within 10 years of the date of grant. And indeed, the option must be capable of exercise within 10 years of the date of grant, at the point at which the option is granted, part of the terms on which the option is granted. PUI and NICs, well, this is talking about the collection by HMRC of income tax and social security contributions. That's what we're referring to by NICs, national insurance contributions. The point to recognise here is that the legislation within the Section 702 of ITIPA, Income Tax Earnings and Pensions Act 2003, comes into effect. If the shares are readily convertible assets, then under Section 702, the income tax is collectible through PUIE, and there is a charge to national insurance contributions, both employees and employers' national insurance contributions. If the shares are not readily convertible assets, then the income tax is collectible through the self-assessment system, and indeed there are no NICs, neither employees nor employers' national insurance contributions. What do we mean by readily convertible assets? Well, clearly, if the company is quoted on a recorded stock exchange, there are trading arrangements in the shares, that's the wording used in Section 702, and the shares are readily convertible assets. But what about a private company? Well, if a company is operating whereby its shares can be traded to an employee share trust, say, for example, then the shares will be readily convertible assets. There might be, as happened some years back with one of our clients, there is a shareholder who is prepared to act as the trading market, if you like, for the shares. The shares will then be readily convertible assets. So do note that point. Please note also that in relation to enterprise management incentives, the legislation itself does not give relief for anything might arise in relation to removal or variation restrictions or special benefits which might attach to the shares, or indeed any conditionality which might arise on the acquisition of the shares. This next slide, okay, what about the shares themselves? They must be fully paid, they must be non-redeemable, and they must be ordinary shares. No fancy or funny shares is the motto there. The shares may be a separate class of shares. I've already alluded to that point, and they can be subject to restrictions or to risk of forfeiture. The important point to recognise, of course, is that these points must be contained within the terms on which the options are exercised, which is set at the date of grant. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. The purpose test. For EMI, well, it's the only tax advantage scheme that requires a purpose test, but it says this, that an option which is a qualifying EMI option can only be granted if for commercial reasons, which is defined as the recruitment and retention of employees and not part of a scheme arrangement, the main purpose, or one of the main purposes of which is the avoidance of tax. So once you actually qualify through compliance with those commercial reasons, the window opens for you to benefit from the tax reliefs which are afforded to the participants through the EMI legislation. Next slide. Okay, so on this slide, we're identifying the £250,000 limit and some of the key points to recognise there. Recognise that is by reference to the unrestricted market value, not the restricted market value. So the restricted market value, there's a whole lecture I do solely on restricted securities, but maybe we'll do a webinar on that sometime in the future. But the restricted position is essentially the actual market value, where whatever restrictions are in place, the actual market value is the current market value, it is the restricted market value. The unrestricted market value is a hypothetical position, which is the market value assuming that restrictions are lifted. So it's typically somewhere between 10 and 20% above restricted market value. So clearly, working with a private company, you've got to make sure that you focus very carefully on your share valuation. Through my practice, we are expert employee share scheme practitioners, but also expert share values. We can offer that same service for share value as we do for employee share schemes. The £250,000 includes EMI and CSOP. So if you've got a CSOP in place, bear in mind that, let's say, for example, you've taken your 30,000 max on CSOP, you've only got 220,000 left on EMI per individual, if indeed you're working with the max. And another pertinent point about the £250,000 limit is once you've actually reached your max in any given company, you've got to wait 3 years before you can actually enter into any further EMI arrangement within that company. I'm often asked, actually, and this has actually arisen only once for me since enterprise management came into place through Finance Act 2000. Can you be a member of EMI in two companies? Well, you can, provided you actually meet the employment conditions. Thank you, Michael. Well anticipated. So, employment status. You must be an employee of the company throughout the whole of the period that the EMI arrangement subsists for that individual. Okay, so employment status must exist right throughout the time that you're an EMI participant. And you must meet the commitment of working time, which is either working 25 hours a week, or if that doesn't cut the mustard, then 75% of your working time. Okay, so typically the first port of call, the first entry would be 25 hours a week, and that's an average position. Although, quite frankly, I seek to make it true that it is actually every week, 25 hours per week. But if that doesn't work, then 75% of your working time. So 75% of your working time. What's meant by working time? Well, it's your employment with the EMI company. It's also employment with any other companies. It's also any self-employment that you might have. So you've got to do a very careful calculation there, that if you can't enter through 25 hours per week, then you do need to be careful that you calculate properly that it is actually 75% of your working time. Commitment of working time also has to work right throughout the life of the option, just as employment status does. But material interest only has to operate at the date of grant, where at the date of grant, you cannot have a material interest in the company which is more than 30%. Okay? That doesn't mean that you can't have an option over more than 30% of the shares. It simply means that at the date of grant, your existing shareholding at that point cannot be more than 30%. Terms of the option, there must be a written agreement. There must be a written agreement to actually support the arrangement. Under paragraph 37, we have set out there the requirements of the written agreement, and they are really some very sort of fundamental points indeed. The date on which the option is granted, the fact that the option is granted under the provisions of the legislation, the number and maximum number of shares that may be acquired through the exercise of the option price, and when and how the options may be exercised. If there are conditions, restrictions, forfeiture, not essential, but if they are, then under paragraph 38 of the legislation, they do have to be actually contained within the option arrangement, as stipulated by the share option contract. Sometimes this is called the bilateral agreement. Okay, it means the same thing. It's a share option contract. That bilateral agreement or share option contract must always have legally binding status. How was that achieved? I suppose historically, in the old days when we introduced employee share schemes, it was through payment of a £1 consideration, and that is still possible. But more effective these days is to execute the document as a deed. Qualifying company. So we've looked at the employee conditions. What about the company conditions? The company must pass these three tests: the independence test, the gross assets test, and the trading activities requirement. Let's just explore those now in detail. The independence test. The company must not be a 51% subsidiary of another company, not just at the date of grant, but right throughout the period of time over which the option subsists for the individual. And remember also that it could be under the control of another company, not just through shareholding. It could be through the representation of that other company on the board of directors. Well, that cannot be a sustainable position for EMI, because the company must not be a 51% subsidiary or under the control of another company through any other means, typically through representation on the board of directors. And at no stage must there be arrangements in place for independence to be lost. Gross assets test. At the date of grant, so this only holds at the date of grant, the gross assets must not exceed 30 million. Okay, so watch very carefully if you're working with a company whose assets are denominated in foreign currency. It's whatever is the is whatever is the conversion of that foreign currency at the date of grant. And remember also that it's not the last balance sheet date, it's actually at the date of grant. So typically we start working with the last balance sheet date and then work forward on the basis of all management accounting information available to determine the gross asset position at the date of grant. If it's group assets we're working with, then it's, yes, the group assets can't exceed 30 million. And do remember that it is actually the gross assets, okay, before the deduction of liabilities. One note on goodwill: it will include goodwill as aggregated across the subsidiaries, but not the consolidated goodwill position. Trading activities requirement. Well, we have a whole series of definitions here. This is a fascinating area for exploration. It always comes up when we're working with the EMI clients. Qualifying trade. Well, the company must be working with a qualifying trade, and that qualifying trade is a trade conducted on a commercial basis with a view to the realization of profit. Okay, we exclude any incidental activities, that they are activities which are of no strategic significance to the company's overall activities. But when we're working with a substantial part, that's very different. Substantial part is very different from incidental activities. Yeah, the company must not have a substantial part that relates to excluded activities. Okay, and that substantial part is typically recognized as 20%. What do we mean by excluded activities? Well, it can't be activities of a speculative nature. For example, the wealth of the company depending upon the growth of a mineral reserve in a hole in the ground in Africa, say, for example. It can't be where there's property and where the underlying risk resides. So let me use an example there. Suppose we're working with an insurance brokers. Okay, typically the underlying risk will not be with the insurance broker; it will be with the insurance underwriter. So in that example, the insurance underwriter would not qualify, but the insurance broker normally would. There are some circumstances where they wouldn't, but normally they would. There's a parallel position in relation to mortgages. So the loan company wouldn't qualify, but the mortgage broker typically would. Property, where the company has a significant land bank and there's a recognition that there's a desire to actually benefit from growth and value of that land bank, then typically that company wouldn't qualify. But a contracting company providing contracting services to a property development company, i.e. building houses, yeah, they would. Permanent establishment, the company must have a permanent establishment in the UK. Disqualifying events: loss of company independence, where there's not a rollover. Any variation in the terms of the option which relate to option price or change in the exercise conditions. Any alteration in the share capital where it disturbs the value of the shares. Okay, and typically where it's not a like for like. Conversion of shares into a different class, again, where it's not a like for like and there's some disturbance in the share value. Any changes in the qualifying trade which encroach into that excluded activities to more than 20%. Any changes in employment status, so if the company ceases to be an employee, for example, or if they cease to meet the commitment of working time. Grant of CSOP options, which takes the total tally over 250,000 for each individual. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. The share valuation, very, very important area indeed. And as I say, in our offering through David Craddock Consultancy Services, we combine expert share valuation with the expert employee share scheme guidance. Very important for the private company to get the share value right. Whatever is the share value actually can actually determine the design of the scheme. But we determine the market value of the shares when the option is granted, and with EMI there, we're able to get a clearance through Shares and Assets Valuation Office of HMRC. We also would conduct a valuation operation when the disqualifying event occurs, or when exercise is triggered, or indeed when there's an exchange of options. But recognise it's only on grant of options that we can actually get that pre-transactional clearance from HMRC on the value of the shares for the grant of the EMI options. Next slide, procedures for operation. There's no tax approval status. We don't get a tax approval clearance from HMRC, so it's absolutely crucial that the advisor working with the company is on the ball and make sure that there's compliance with the qualifying company criteria and with the eligible employee criteria, and that the terms of option are all properly in place. Instead, we do an electronic notification for HMRC. We provide that service again through our business. We have expert services on that. It's essentially a notice sent by the employing company at grant. Correction of notification by HMRC, well, they have the right to do that if they so choose, and clearly it means it's so crucially important on the advisor to make sure that the advice given is correct and everything is properly in place. HMRC do actually have a right of inquiry. Do we ever want to get to that position? No, we don't. So we need to make sure everything's right at the date of grant. If there is a right of inquiry, there is a right of appeal, but we don't want to get into that territory. Documents sent to HMRC, well, it is this electronic notification at grant. We have the service we offer is soup to nuts. We start with the design of the scheme, the share valuation, move through all the preparation of the legals, right through to the administration and the notifications to HMRC and Companies House. We don't need to submit any other documents at grant to HMRC other than this electronic notification. But we need to make sure all documents are properly in place because, well, there's the fundamental point, of course, in making sure everything is legally watertight and employees have their documents, and Companies House have their documents, but HMRC can actually request documents, and those documents must be available on request. And then, of course, there's the electronic annual tax reporting, which has to be in by the 5th of July each year following the tax year in which any activity has taken place. Very powerful device here. I've just thrown this slide in as a teaser. Okay, if Michael chooses to invite me back to talk about employee share trust, thank you very much, Michael. I'd love to do that. But the formula for a long-term incentive plan working with EMI is to combine it with an employee share trust. An incredibly powerful mechanism indeed. Recycling shares, granting options over those shares which are held by the trust, and then allowing the share trust to dispense those shares to the employees at the point of exercise. Okay, next slide. Recognize that we focused in this seminar on enterprise management incentives, the most tax efficient employee share scheme ever to be introduced anywhere in the world. But we need to make absolutely sure that we're complying with all relevant security laws and financial services laws. There's got to be the company authorities in place through the Articles of Association. The employee share scheme must meet the criteria for a bona fide employee share scheme, which is defined in section 1166 of the Companies Act 2006. We must meet the requirements on the security laws. We must make sure there's proper shareholder approval in place, and also delegation through the articles to the directors to issue shares and to organise the administration of the employee share scheme arrangement. We've got to make absolutely sure that we comply with the financial assistance rules. Very, very important indeed. If you're a quoted company, there's a whole pile of exemptions available. If you're a private company, there's directors' issues in relation to governance, which we need to give proper recognition to, and indeed on financial services. Provided that the company is a proper employee share scheme and it complies with the financial services legislation, then there is the opportunity to get exemptions from a prospectus. Otherwise, that would be a very onerous activity. But there's never any exemption from the communication to the employees. And indeed, this is also supported by laws of tort, which relate to negligence. That communication must be as though it is to an outside person, even though they are within your company. That's why you do need the advice to make absolutely sure you get it right. You really do. But once you get it right, that share is available within the employee share scheme to generate wealth for the employees, to identify that identity of interest with the shareholders, and yes, to be the prime business motivator within the business. This is my final slide. So I am David Craddock. I've introduced myself, and Michael very kindly introduced me at the outset. Consultant, lecturer, author, specialist in employee share schemes. I'm the author of the Tolley's Guide to Employee Share Schemes. We offer services in employee share schemes, share valuation, management buyout, succession planning, and indeed investment education. So please let us know if we can be of any help. I'm very pleased to answer your questions. If you've got questions you want to write to me about, then I will provide written answers through email. Over to you, Michael.
David, indeed, and thank you very much. I don't think it's been a while since I've heard somebody describe a tax scheme as lovely. So
absolutely, why not?
Now we've got quite a few questions here, and so could I ask you to be pretty snappy on some of them, and I'll try and get out the quick ones early. First, probably a quick question is, I was under the impression that entrepreneurs' tax relief depended on the percentage of equity held. Is that not also true of incentive options?
No, the special rules for entrepreneurs relief for enterprise management incentives is contained within the same section 169H of Taxation Chargeable Gains Act 1992, but the criteria is different. The outcome is the same: 10% tax, 10% tax on your capital gain, but the criteria is different. Whereas for the mainline entrepreneurs relief, there needs to be at least a 5% holding. There doesn't have to be 5% holding for enterprise management incentives special type of entrepreneurs relief. And there doesn't have to be voting rights either. And recognise the other difference, which is that the time period for the EMI entrepreneurs relief is the time period from the date of grant to the date of sale. There doesn't have to be an ownership period of 2 years, which is the case in the mainline entrepreneurs relief. Hopefully that gives you some precise answer to your question, some context.
Another point, David, can this scheme be used by LLPs or is it solely for limited companies?
It cannot be used for an LLP, no. And the tax efficiencies and indeed the integrity, I think, of LLPs has been severely undermined in recent years. And sometimes, actually, we work with companies to convert their businesses from an LLP into a limited company so that, well, not just so they can introduce employee share schemes, but so they can have all the other advantages of working with a limited company. My clear advice is always to work with a limited company, not just for employee share scheme purposes, but for other purposes as well.
Are there limits to shareholder approval requirements for such a scheme?
Well, if you're working with a private company, then no. If you're working with a quoted company, then you'd need to work with the investment committee guidelines that they would apply to EMI just as they would apply to any other employee share scheme, whether it's a tax advantage scheme or indeed a tax unapproved scheme. But when you're working with a private company, you've really got a blank canvas on which to paint.
Okay. Another question here. This is a somewhat detailed bit, but I think if you could just stick to the core of it, please. I'm about to have to create a second scheme as the first EMI one ran out after 10 years.
Yeah.
Is there anything special about this, given we have several employees with unexercised options under the old scheme, and share prices were underwater a few years running, so they haven't been exercised? If I just copy the legally okay previous version, do I really need a lawyer to check the new one?
It wouldn't be smart to simply copy a scheme which was introduced 10 years ago. Legislation has changed dramatically. Let me give you some indication. My first edition of Tolley's Guide to Employee Share Schemes came out in 2010. My second edition came out in 2016. 2/3 of it was a rewrite and new material. Okay, that's how fast legislation changes on employee share schemes. In recent years, with the concentration on Brexit and various other preoccupations, there's not been that many changes, but no, firm advice is you're going to need new scheme rules. You recognise also, my friend, that the environments in which your company is operating has changed. The market will have changed. Your company will have changed. Always we need to bespoke the arrangement to the company concerned. So you need to get new advice. Yeah, absolutely.
And I'm going to wrap up a couple of questions. A lot of people would just like an indication, really, on the measures of success. So two sub-questions, really. What's the rough percentage of businesses in the UK who've taken advantage of EMI?
I can't give an answer to that straight off. It's actually included in the HMRC figures, which I do have in my files, and I could go to as soon as I've actually finished this webinar. But if you want me, I can actually give that answer to you by an email. You can dispense
Do you
that
have
out.
just a rough guess, or is that putting you on the spot?
That'll put me on the spot a bit. And recognise also that there are other share schemes, other tax advantage schemes, other tax unapproved schemes. Ironically, the tax unapproved schemes sometimes can be made more tax efficient than the tax approved schemes. So we've determined lots of different ways in order to achieve that through legitimate application of the legislation. Nothing untoward or a sidewalk on that. Completely mainline application of tax principles.
And final question then. Excellent presentation, David. How strong is the evidence for the success of employee share schemes?
There is now very, very substantial evidence indeed, through the US and the UK in particular, those two countries, because that's where we have the tax advantage schemes in the UK and the tax qualifying plans in the US. Always, I would say, it depends upon very, very serious application of communication processes, and a very clear idea of how an employee share scheme will work in your business. I cannot emphasize enough that it's always a bespoke arrangement which works best. But yes, that there's lots and lots of evidence. Recently, very, very interesting evidence produced by CAS, but universities, institutes throughout the US and the UK. In the UK, stuff that's come out of the London School of Economics, Keele University, Manchester Metropolitan, York University, Newcastle University. It's all in my book, Tolley's Guide to Employee Share Schemes. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, David.
And any other questions, do email me. I'll be very, very pleased to answer them. And
thank you very much, David. That's been really helpful. We do have a few more questions here we haven't had time to, including one about some crazy crypto, but we'll get those over to you offline.
Yeah, sure.
Meanwhile, if I could end really by pointing out there are quite a few resources at the ESOP Center which are available to you. We have a monthly newsletter. It's Our Business, written by the inimitable Fred Hackworth, and has been going for a number of years and is fascinating and really takes a good international but detailed perspective. Further, I might point out that this is part of a wider long finance exploration of how to reduce inequalities. That's Sustainable Development Goal 10 under the UN. And we have a bulletin on that, as well as a bulletin on employee share ownership. You can subscribe to both of those for free. But it remains for me, really, David, on a webinar like this, I have to summarize, and I've seen quite a few very complimentary comments about your presentation. I'll give you kind of a virtual audience clap. So thank you, David, for being an expert in covering a very interesting but nevertheless complex field so rapidly. Much more online, people. But can I thank you too, the audience, and remind you that there are a number of seminars coming up, in particular next week, again at the Long Finance site or at the ESOP Center site. So if I could say thanks to one and all, and thanks to you, David, it's goodbye from here, and I will turn the webinar off. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.